The rain began before dawn, a thin silver curtain over the iron gates of Iron Court, the kind of rain that blurred headlights and softened the outlines of armed guards posted along the compound walls. And when the black sedan rolled through the outer checkpoint, no one inside the command building expected the passenger to change the balance of power inside the city's most feared syndicate. But in the upper office where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sleeping skyline, Wu Bin-yun had already been told the file contained an anomaly, an Omega with no recorded scent classification, no family registry, no academy record. And yet the intelligence division insisted he had dismantled an assassination cell in 12 seconds inside a convenience store camera frame that skipped twice, as if the footage itself struggled to follow his movements. And when the office doors opened, the guards who escorted him stepped aside almost too quickly, like men unconsciously moving away from a blade they couldn't see. Because Han Li walked into the room with the same quiet gravity he carried on battlefields no one officially admitted existed, dark coat still damp from the rain, eyes steady but unreadable. And the silence that followed was not the usual intimidation that Alphas imposed, but something stranger, a calculation that moved across the room like cold air. Wu Bin-yun watching without rising from his chair, measuring posture, breath. The absence of nervous energy that normally accompanied Omegas inside a building filled with dominant pheromones. Yet the room did not shift around Han Li the way biology predicted it should, as if the rules had quietly stepped aside to see what would happen next. And for a moment the city itself seemed to pause with them, distant traffic humming like a low heartbeat under the storm, until Wu Bin-yun finally spoke in a voice calm enough to hide the weight behind the words, asking a single question that was less about loyalty and more about intention. Why someone like him would step into a war already forming in the shadows of 7 rival syndicates preparing to strike Iron Court at once. And Han Li did not answer immediately, because answers had always been dangerous currency in places where information could become chains. Instead, his gaze shifted briefly to the window where lightning revealed the skyline in white flashes, then back again. And when he spoke, it was quiet but precise, saying he was not here to belong to the syndicate, only to stand where the line would eventually be drawn, which should have sounded like refusal, but instead made the faintest trace of interest cross Wu Bin-yun's expression. Because in a world built on ownership and dominance, the idea of someone choosing the battlefield rather than the master was both inconvenient and valuable. And somewhere below the office level, alarms flickered silently on a security monitor as the perimeter sensors registered movement beyond the outer wall, a reconnaissance probe from enemies testing distance and response time. Yet neither man turned toward the screen because the real calculation was happening between them. A negotiation without contracts, without promises, only the recognition that both of them understood something about survival that the rest of the underworld had not yet learned. And when Wu Bin-yun finally stood, the room seemed to shift slightly, Alpha presence filling the air like pressure before a storm. But Han Li didn't step back or lower his eyes the way most would. And that was the moment the decision was made without being announced. The moment Iron Court unknowingly gained a guardian who did not consider himself one. And outside, the rain intensified against the glass, as if the city itself was preparing for the conflict that would begin long before anyone realized the first move had already been made. By the time the rain faded into a cold mist that clung to the compound walls, Iron Court had already begun to feel different, not because orders had changed or patrol routes had been rewritten, but because the presence of the quiet Omega who now moved through the corridors had shifted the rhythm of the place in subtle ways the guards could not quite explain. And throughout the morning, reports arrived from outer contacts describing unusual movements across the city, small groups gathering, encrypted calls between rival syndicates that normally preferred to hate each other rather than cooperate, shipments diverted at the docks, and warehouses going dark one by one, as if someone were slowly dimming the lights of an entire underworld district. Yet inside the command center, Wu Bin-yun remained seated with the same controlled stillness he had shown the night before while Han Li stood beside a table scattered with surveillance photos. His eyes moving over them not like someone studying criminals, but like someone mapping terrain before a storm. And when one of the senior lieutenants, an Alpha who had held territory long before Iron Court expanded, asked bluntly why an Omega outsider had been allowed access to internal strategy, the room tightened with expectation. Because challenges inside syndicates rarely ended politely, but Han Li simply reached forward and rotated one of the photographs 90 degrees, revealing something the others had missed entirely, a reflection in a window behind the target building that showed a second sniper position hidden across the street. And the silence that followed was heavier than anger because realization spread across the table that he was seeing layers none of them had considered, which was when the first alarm sounded, not loud, just a controlled signal from the west perimeter indicating a breach attempt that was too careful to be random. And while several guards reached instinctively for weapons, Han Li was already moving toward the corridor with a speed that didn't look hurried, yet somehow reached the security wing before anyone else. Wu Bin-yun following not out of urgency but interest, watching the way cameras flickered across monitors as shadows moved along the outer fence line. 5 intruders testing the response timing, perhaps expecting the compound to react like any other stronghold in the city, predictable, proud, and slow to adjust. Yet when the outer lights briefly dimmed and then returned brighter than before, the intruders hesitated, sensing something had shifted. And in that hesitation, Han Li slipped outside into the cold air, where the mist had turned the courtyard into a pale gray field of visibility and silence. The kind of silence that hides footsteps until they are too close to escape. And from the balcony above, Wu Bin-yun observed without interfering as the encounter unfolded not like a battle, but like a correction in the night's balance. Movements precise, efficient, each attacker neutralized before the others fully understood what had happened. And when it was over, the guards arriving seconds later found the intruders disarmed and breathing but unable to move, their weapons lined neatly beside them as if placed there deliberately to send a message back to whoever had sent them. Which was when Han Li looked up toward the balcony, and for a brief moment the distance between bodyguard and leader felt less like hierarchy and more like a silent agreement forming. Because neither of them had spoken about the coming war, yet both clearly understood that the city had already begun testing its edges. And as the captured scouts were taken below for interrogation, the compound returned to its quiet routine, outwardly unchanged. But rumors started spreading through the ranks before noon that the mysterious Omega had ended the infiltration without a single shot fired, a detail that traveled faster than official reports ever could. While inside the office, once again the skyline appeared clearer now that the rain had stopped, the streets glistening under pale sunlight, and Wu Bin-yun finally asked the question he had not asked the night before. Not about loyalty or employment, but about prediction. How long until the real attack began? And Han Li studied the distant buildings, as if listening to something beneath the city's noise, before answering in the same calm tone that never seemed to rise above the room, yet always settled exactly where it needed to be, saying that reconnaissance was never sent alone unless it was measuring confidence, which meant the coalition had already decided Iron Court was worth the risk, and that when the next move came, it would not arrive from one direction but from everywhere at once. A statement that should have sounded like warning, yet carried the quiet certainty of someone who had already lived through wars designed exactly this way. And as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the office floor, the realization settled between them that what had begun as a simple hearing decision had now turned into the first line of defense in a conflict large enough to redraw the map of the city's power before anyone outside those walls even realized the game had started. The city did not announce the shift openly, but by the second night the pattern had begun forming in ways only people trained to watch the quiet parts of chaos could recognize. And inside Iron Court, the air carried the restrained tension of an organization waiting for something it could not yet see clearly. Reports arriving one after another describing unfamiliar faces in districts usually controlled by long-standing alliances. Transport routes briefly blocked and then cleared as if someone were testing the speed of response, and the subtle disappearance of informants who had always been reliable until suddenly they were not. Which was why Han Li spent most of the evening not in the command room but moving through the compound itself, learning its architecture the way he learned any operational space, memorizing not just hallways and exits, but the rhythm of footsteps, the scent flow through ventilation shafts, the blind spots between cameras that even good systems always possessed. And while several guards initially watched him with the quiet suspicion reserved for outsiders, that suspicion began to thin the moment he started correcting small weaknesses none of them had noticed, repositioning a patrol by 2 minutes to close a gap, redirecting a sensor toward a maintenance gate that had been ignored for years, instructing the technicians to rotate frequency bands on the security channels before midnight without explaining why until exactly midnight arrived, and a burst of intercepted interference lit the monitors like a signal flare, proving someone outside had already been attempting to map their communications, which shifted the way the guards looked at him from cautious tolerance to the beginning of trust. a trust that did not come easily in places like this, but once earned tended to hold under pressure. And throughout all of it, Wu Bin-yun watched with the same composed attention he gave to negotiations and battles alike, noticing how Han Li never raised his voice, never insisted on authority he had not yet been given. Yet somehow the compound's defensive network was quietly reorganizing around him, as though gravity itself had adjusted direction. Until late that evening, when Doc Dong entered the operations room carrying a file thicker than expected for routine intelligence, and placed it on the table with the expression of someone who had just discovered a pattern he didn't like, explaining that shipments connected to 3 different syndicates had begun moving through neutral ports simultaneously, something that normally only happened before a coordinated offensive. And the room grew still as the implication settled that the city's rival factions might actually be aligning against Iron Court, a possibility that would have sounded impossible weeks ago, yet now felt disturbingly plausible given how the last 2 days had unfolded, which was when Han Li asked for the shipment routes and studied them for a long moment before tracing a line across the map that cut directly through one district no one else had mentioned. An abandoned industrial corridor most organizations ignored because it offered little profit and even less strategic value, except that he explained quietly that places ignored by everyone tended to become staging grounds for people who wanted to arrive unseen. And as the realization spread across the table, a messenger burst into the room carrying confirmation that unknown operatives had already been spotted moving through that exact corridor less than an hour earlier, which meant the timeline had accelerated faster than anyone predicted. Yet instead of alarm, what followed was a strange calm, the kind that appears when uncertainty finally becomes something concrete enough to plan against. And within minutes, orders were moving through the compound like a carefully controlled current, patrol routes doubling, internal doors locking into staggered security cycles, communication lines narrowing to encrypted channels only. While outside, the city lights shimmered across the river as though nothing unusual was happening at all, a peaceful view that hid the quiet mobilization unfolding across rooftops and back alleys and empty warehouses, where armed groups prepared for a conflict none of the civilians sleeping nearby would ever hear about. And sometime after midnight, Han Li stepped out onto the upper balcony again, where the air had grown colder and clearer, the skyline stretching out beneath the moon in a way that made the city look almost calm despite the movement building within it. And for a few moments, he stood there alone until Wu Bin-yun joined him without announcing his presence, the two of them looking out over the same horizon, while the compound behind them adjusted to the new defensive structure that had been built in less than 24 hours. And after a while, Wu Bin-yun asked a simple question that carried more weight than it sounded: whether the attack would come tonight or tomorrow, to which Han Li replied after considering the silence of the streets below that the coalition would wait just long enough to believe their preparations had gone unnoticed, because confidence was the most useful weakness in operations like this, and that when they moved it would likely be sudden and overwhelming enough to convince Iron Court resistance was pointless. A strategy that might have worked against most organizations, but had already begun failing the moment they underestimated the person currently standing on that balcony. And though neither of them said it aloud, there was a growing understanding forming between them that the approaching conflict was no longer just about territory or power, but something more personal for Han Li, something tied to the shadow network that had shaped his past and now appeared to be circling closer with every passing hour. And as the night deepened, and the compound lights dimmed to their defensive configuration, the city continued preparing in quiet ways, unaware that the moment the first real strike arrived it would set off a chain of events capable of changing the balance of every syndicate operating within its borders. By the time the first alarms tripped at 1:42 a.m., Han Li had already moved through the lower levels of Iron Court twice, checking corridors, recalibrating traps, and positioning the handful of guards he trusted with lethal and non-lethal contingencies alike. Each movement deliberate, economical, and precise, the sort of choreography that left no room for improvisation because improvisation had a way of creating weaknesses even the most alert operative could not patch in real time. And when the sensor grid flashed red with unauthorized movement in the eastern approach, Han Li did not panic, did not shout, did not call for immediate reinforcements. He simply traced the pattern across the tablet in his hand, noted the timing and spacing of the intruders' steps, and realized immediately that these were not scouts or reconnaissance teams, but an initial wave of the coalition assault, carefully measured, disciplined, trained in a way that implied years of preparation for exactly this compound layout. yet still unfamiliar enough in their approach that he could anticipate every adjustment they would make as they moved through the corridor's traps into the courtyard and toward the main building, and he waited, watching the shadowed faces on the live feed, tracking the frequency interference that suggested suppressed weapons and communications jamming, while the ambient stress in the compound increased in the way Han Li had learned to read as a secondary, almost invisible sensor. The subtle twitch of a guard's finger near a trigger, the involuntary pause in breath when a projector flashed across a security camera, the soft, unnatural hiss of the ventilation system as if it too were holding its breath, and when the first breach point opened just past the northern gate, Han Li was already in motion, sliding silently into the shadows, redirecting one operative into a maintenance shaft, allowing two others to fall for a trap he had set earlier by aligning reflective surfaces to blind their thermal optics. Neutralizing three in as many seconds without leaving a trace of noise beyond the barely perceptible scuff of a boot against marble. And yet even as the courtyard filled with the advancing wave, he noted the signature of a frequency that belonged to Veil-issued gear, the subtle hum of devices designed to disrupt olfactory tracking, which meant someone in this coalition had not just planned an assault. They had inserted themselves into the plan to control the outcome of specific engagements. And Han Li understood immediately that this was not just the coalition testing Iron Court. It was Veil embedding a move of its own in the first wave, a way to remove him under cover of a larger battle. But he had already accounted for it, every sensor, every corridor, every trap, every guard repositioned with adjustments calculated to neutralize not just numbers but specialized assets. And when the operatives reached the courtyard proper, the first shots were fired, precise, non-lethal. Stunning rounds that Han Li had positioned to maximize incapacitation without fatality, the sequence unfolding like clockwork. And yet in the chaos, he registered a heat signature distinct from the others, the telltale biological imprint of an Omega long suppressed but now present in the immediate area, and he moved toward it with the same cold efficiency that had marked him for years, intercepting a Veil operative who had broken the pattern to approach him directly. Neutralizing the threat with a wrist lock and pressure strike, blood warming his palms but controlled, collected, the suppression tattoos in his forearms working overtime, while other operatives collapsed around him in the perimeter firelight as the coalition struggled to adapt to the unconventional resistance. And even as they regrouped, he was already adjusting, moving from shadow to shadow, redirecting incoming units into pre-planned choke points, reading the biological, thermal, and tactical signatures simultaneously, nodding the interplay between external assaults and internal responses with an almost obsessive clarity. And when Wu Bin arrived on the balcony with Dak Gong a silent observer, Han Li allowed the smallest acknowledgement of their presence, eyes flicking once, measuring the gap between strategic necessity and personal trust. The air heavy with the knowledge that the night's events would not merely end with a repelled attack, but with a reckoning for those who had underestimated Iron Court's operative. While outside the courtyard the city remained oblivious, streets empty under moonlight, unaware of the precise, lethal yet controlled choreography unfolding in the compound below. A dance that blended survival, loyalty, and operational perfection into a single relentless rhythm. And as the first hour of engagement concluded, 27 coalition operatives were lying incapacitated across the marble and flagstone, alive but neutralized, and Han Li, bleeding from minor scrapes and bruises yet fully present, took a breath and allowed himself a fraction of satisfaction, knowing this was only the beginning, that the coalition still had layers, that Veil had yet to fully reveal its hand, but that the Iron Court would endure precisely because he had chosen to endure, because he had chosen the rules of engagement. Because he had chosen to be present when the rest of the world believed he would not be. The second wave arrived from the east gate at 2:08 a.m. Not scouts this time, not measurement, but precision units of the Triad Ghost Division, trained to assume control of compromised zones and operating under the assumption that the east sector was already in disarray. Yet Han Li had anticipated every assumption and every step. He met them at the courtyard threshold, bleeding now from his left side and right shoulder, the suppressants in his tattoos running at diminished capacity but still functional enough to mask the most dangerous edge of his Omega signature. And he moved like a phantom across the marble steps, forcing the first column to collide with its own momentum, using the steps as a mechanical advantage, letting gravity, space, and the disciplined confusion he had engineered turn the Triad's formation into a liability, and all while his mind catalogued every micro-expression of each operative's movements. Their breathing, the weight distribution in their feet, the slight hesitation in their grips that betrayed prior training under false assumptions. So that by the time they realized the courtyard was a controlled kill zone, 16 operatives were incapacitated, bodies neutralized without lethal damage. Sprawled across the pale stone in neat arcs, an unspoken signature that spoke of control, precision, and restraint. And yet even as he processed the success of the maneuver, Hanli detected the subtle frequency overlay from Veil gear. A counterbalance, a shadow within the shadow, someone manipulating the unit's actions remotely, adjusting timing, creating openings and vulnerabilities specifically for him, for Henley. As though Veil had anticipated his anticipations and threaded a needle of control into the night's chaos. And for a heartbeat, the weight of it hit him, the edge of 3 years. Suppressed designation biology stirring, the heat at the inside of his forearms, the familiar twitch of a system under stress that was not supposed to be breached, and he moved through it anyway. Pure operational momentum carrying him to the corner of the courtyard, where a reinforced gate had been modified with reflective surfaces and micro-traps, turning it into a funnel, a decoy, a vector of illusion that drew the remaining operatives exactly where he wanted, while the shadows themselves seemed to bend to his will, or at least to his calculation of their path, and when Commander Yun finally emerged from the eastern wall. Having recovered far quicker than any standard tranquilizer should have allowed, the subtle tension in Han Li's muscles flared, the tattoos in his forearms buzzing like suppressed warnings. But he met Yun with the precision of a man trained to integrate threat and opportunity in the same breath, redirecting the Veil operative with a non-lethal strike that exploited momentum and leverage rather than raw force, filing each strike, each misstep, each breach in his operational ledger, and still bleeding. Still exhausted, still awake for over 90 hours, he moved like a shadow across the courtyard, neutralizing 7 more, the moonlight reflecting off the marble steps, fires along the perimeter casting long orange streaks over his path. The smell of ozone and smoke intermingling with the biological scent his body could no longer fully suppress. Yet he remained entirely composed, entirely operational, entirely present. The center of the storm, while the storm itself unfolded around him with every wave, every unit, every calculated misdirection feeding into his understanding, feeding into the rhythm he had set. And when Wu Bin and Dak Yong finally stepped out onto the balcony above, assessing the chaos, Han Li allowed the barest acknowledgement, a nod to presence, to coordination, a shared recognition that the night was not yet over, that Veil's interference was still present, still dangerous. But that Iron Court would survive, because its operative had already determined the rules of engagement and the calculus of every life and every action. And for Henley, for the first time in 3 years, the acknowledgement that he was not merely an instrument but a variable in his own terms, a human who had chosen the timing, the method, the boundaries, and the engagement itself. The third wave struck not from the perimeter, but from above, descending silently from the eastern walls in darkened gear that bore none of the syndicate's insignia, moving with the lethal economy of Veil-trained assets who had been inserted specifically to test and contain him. Han Li was already primed, secondary drawn, 3 rounds remaining in his primary, muscles and mind balancing on the edge of exhaustion, the suppressant tattoos struggling to maintain equilibrium against the surge of his designation, now fully awake in a confined space with activated alphas around him. And as the operatives hit the courtyard with precise timing, Han Li flowed through the engagement with the deliberate rhythm he had spent 7 days designing. Neutralizing 4 operatives in rapid succession without breaking stride, exploiting their insertion points, leveraging their momentum against themselves, each strike measured and precise, bone, joint, nerve, all catalogued and deployed as tactical vectors rather than violence. And yet every movement carried the personal weight of every encounter he had endured over 3 years. Betrayals, missions where life and loyalty had been weaponized, the silent training rooms where trust had been both forged and extinguished, every lesson compressed into instinct, into the seamless articulation of control over chaos, until only Yun remained, his former handler calm as ever, stepping into the courtyard with a pace that carried certainty rather than conflict, observing the bodies, the fires, the moonlight reflecting off the marble steps. And Han Li felt the system inside him teeter on the edge, the suppressant's last reserve straining to counteract the compounded stress of fatigue, injury, and Omega biological response. Yet he moved without hesitation, meeting Yun's approach with the cold precision that had become his signature, redirecting the device in Yun's hand into the stone balustrade, neutralizing the final threat and emotion as fluid as thought, filing each microsecond of the encounter into memory, every twitch. Every adjustment, every variable accounted for in a ledger that no one else could see, while the scent of his designation poured into the night air, unavoidable, undeniable, declaring presence, dominance, and survival. And when Wu Bin finally appeared in the doorway behind Yun, the recognition in his gaze was quiet but absolute. Understanding without words that Han Li had executed the impossible turned chaos into control, and survived not because of loyalty, not because of biology, not because of training alone, but because he had chosen every step, every engagement, every variable asserting agency over the night, over the compound, over the people who had underestimated him. And standing atop the marble steps, bleeding, exhausted, designation exposed, Han Li allowed a single moment of stillness, not relief, not triumph, but acknowledgement of the night's calculus, the precision, the cost, and the truth that he had survived on his own terms, and that in doing so, the Iron Court, Wu Bin, and the fragile architecture of operational control had all been preserved, intact but changed, reshaped by the presence of an Omega who had refused to be weaponized without choice. The first light of dawn crept across Seoul, brushing the Iron Court compound with the indifferent gold of a city that had survived the impossible without knowing it, and Han Li remained atop the marble steps, bleeding into the air with the scent of a designation unbound, muscles aching, suppressant tattoos flickering and recalibrating as if reluctant to admit they had been pushed past their design, while the 53 neutralized operatives were being processed downstairs under Dak Yong's precise supervision. Alive but rendered inert, their bodies arranged with deliberate care, every measure of violence replaced with controlled neutralization, an operational ethic he had chosen long before Vale had made him an instrument. And when Wu Bin finally descended the inner steps to stand beside him, it was not with the distance of authority, but with the presence of a man who understood that what had occurred could not be filed into protocol. That survival and control had been wrenched from chaos and shaped by intention alone. Han Li treated his wounds with the methodical attention of someone who had catalogued every failure, every threshold exceeded, from the deep laceration along his left side to the bruising in his shoulder, assessing what the next hours would cost him. And when he finished, Wu Bin handed him a phone, the screen displaying the transmission of Vale's internal records sent hours before the last wave had been neutralized, a permanent exposure of a program designed to erase and control. Laid bare across multiple intelligence networks and investigative journalists, and Han Li realized the scale of it. The operational victory was only one part, the political and institutional fracturing was another, a chessboard spanning continents, every piece now moving according to the will of someone who had been stateless until tonight, whose loyalty was no longer borrowed but chosen. And as Wu Bin's gaze met his, steady, unflinching, equal rather than superior, Han Li felt the weight of 9 years of survival and training crystallize into clarity, understanding that the night had ended not with defeat, not with victory, but with the creation of a new equilibrium, one where he had agency, where the program's reach had been pierced, where his presence alone redefined operational parameters. And as the city woke oblivious, he sat beside Wu Bin in quiet acknowledgement, fully aware that the work of dismantling Vale had only just begun. And that every decision from here on would be a choice, not a mandate, a calculus of strategy, loyalty, and personal will, measured in moments, in risks, in the subtle, unbroken assertion of control that had defined his life, and tonight had defined his freedom. By mid-morning, the Iron Court compound hummed with controlled activity, every operative moving with precision under Dak Yong's supervision. The courtyard cleared, the fires reduced to smoldering embers, yet beneath the surface, tension wound through the corridors like an electric current, because Han Li knew the night had changed everything. The coalition assault had failed, Vale had been exposed, and the power dynamics of Seoul, Ben, and Tokyo had shifted irrevocably. But he also knew that operational victories were only temporary if the human element was underestimated. And as he walked beside Wu Bin through the compound's inner halls, silent in the aftermath, every step cataloging the positions of loyalists and residual threats, he considered the delicate architecture of alliances, realizing that even now, the remaining syndicates would recalibrate their strategies, motivated by fear, pride, and opportunity, and that Vale's operatives scattered across the field, still active despite exposure, represented an unpredictable vector of danger that could strike anywhere, anytime, a ghost network whose loyalty had always been conditional and whose skill was unmatched. They stopped in the central command room, where a large digital display flickered with live feeds from the perimeter cameras, showing the cleanup operations in progress, and Hanli ran his eyes over each image, noting small anomalies. An unsynchronized patrol, a shifted shadow, a shutter that hadn't reset, trivial perhaps, but enough to remind him that control was never absolute, and that a compound, no matter how fortified, was only as secure as the minds defending it. And as Wu Bin began issuing post-summit debrief orders to the inner circle, Hanli observed silently, not to assert authority, but to map influence, to identify who had the temperament to act under pressure, who could be trusted with calibrated risk, and who would crumble under scrutiny, because rebuilding the power structure after Vale's infiltration required more than brute force. It required subtlety, precision, and the ability to anticipate moves before they materialized. And while Wu Bin spoke to the room, Hanli's mind calculated trajectories, operationally and politically, marking who would be assets, who would be liabilities, and who, if left unchecked, might resurrect the chaos Vale had seeded. And when the debrief ended, he remained behind, alone in the command room, tracing the encrypted network paths he had once designed for the Vale program. Now repurposing the intelligence to create a dismantlement framework, cataloging field operatives, secondary safe houses, and rotating communication nodes, every line of code a reminder that mastery of a system from within was the only way to ensure it could be unmade. And as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the polished floors, Hanli allowed himself a moment to feel the weight of choice, of power, of knowledge, fully aware that each decision from this point forward would echo across 3 countries, affect dozens of lives, and carry consequences far beyond the Iron Court walls. Yet despite the immense responsibility, he felt something he hadn't in years. A quiet certainty that he was no longer just a pawn, an instrument, a stateless variable, but the architect of his own operational destiny. And in that clarity, he began the slow, deliberate work of transforming exposure into leverage, chaos into opportunity, and survival into agency. Night fell again over Seoul, and the city below the Iron Court compound seemed oblivious to the storm that had just passed, and the one that was slowly forming. As Hanli sat in the quiet of his temporary operations room, surrounded by the residual hum of electronics, the soft glow of monitors illuminating the faint scars along his forearms where the suppressant tattoos had burned and healed, still recalibrating to the new threshold of his biology. His mind running through the network of Vale operatives he now had the capacity to track, identifying 11 active agents, cross-referencing known field patterns, supply caches, and communication protocols. A living map of a ghost network that had once defined him and now threatened everything he had rebuilt, while Wu Bin moved through the compound coordinating with Dokyeong, ensuring perimeter defenses were reinforced, and reaching out to distant allies in Ben and Tokyo with instructions for surveillance and potential intercepts, each message carefully phrased to maintain operational security while subtly planting seeds of leverage against the syndicates whose trust had been fractured by last night's events. Hanli, however, focused inward, thinking in terms of cycles, triggers, and responses, what Vale had anticipated in him, what they hadn't, and how that gap could be exploited, recognizing patterns in the timing of supply drops, signal rotations, and secondary extraction points, and nodding where residual Vale influence still lingered in the city's underworld, dormant but ready to react. And as the hours crept toward midnight, he traced one operative's movements through the night streets. Nodding familiar tactics, methods, even the cadence of footsteps that mirrored his own training, knowing that interception required more than brute force. It required patience, understanding of psychology, and the capacity to predict instinctive decisions that even the agents themselves were barely aware of. And when a calm alert blinked on his screen signaling a potential breach at a secondary Vale cache, he didn't rush. He calculated, measured, and deployed a single operative under cover, ensuring the capture of critical data while leaving no trace of his own intervention. Because Hanli had learned that Vale's most dangerous tool had always been uncertainty, and by imposing controlled certainty, he could turn their own methods against them, destabilizing their structure one precise action at a time, until their carefully hidden architecture would unravel into patterns he could exploit, and in the quiet aftermath. With Seoul's skyline glittering indifferently beyond the compound walls, Hanli allowed himself a rare thought of something almost forgotten. Anticipation, not fear, not the operational dread that had defined him for years, but the thrill of the hunt, the elegance of a plan executed with precision against an opponent that had once defined his every movement. And in that moment, he realized that the night was not just survival, not just vengeance or exposure, but the beginning of a long game, where knowledge, patience, and control were the only weapons that truly mattered. The city beyond the Iron Court slept under the thin veneer of normalcy, unaware that its shadows were being measured and mapped with the cold precision of someone who had once been both hunter and hunted. As Han Li moved through the corridors of the compound, every step deliberate, feeling the faint pulse of his failing suppressants beneath his skin, a reminder of the fragility of control. And yet his mind was a machine, cataloging, cross-referencing, and calculating each element of Vale's remaining reach. Wu Bin sat across from him at the central command table, reviewing the decrypted files Han Li had helped assemble, the room dimly lit by monitors that displayed locations, signal traces, and operative signatures, while Dokkyong moved silently, coordinating extraction routes and internal security with the precision of someone who had learned to respect Han Li's methods without question. And outside, the city hummed with indifference. Unaware of the subtle shifts in the balance of power that would ripple through its underground networks over the coming weeks, Han Li's focus was on pattern disruption, identifying communication hubs, rotation protocols, and operatives whose presence had been invisible to previous intelligence sweeps, mapping the flow of Vale's influence like a river with hidden tributaries, knowing that each operative he neutralized or turned would send shockwaves through the organization, weakening it before it could react. At 1:03 a.m., a subtle signal reached his tablet. A courier, small, unarmed, moving through the alleyways with something critical to Vale's secondary operations. Han Li didn't hesitate. He followed the path silently, relying on instinct honed over 9 years of extraction, suppression, and observation, understanding every decision the courier would make, because it mirrored what he would have done in the same circumstances. And by the time the operative realized they were compromised, Han Li had intercepted, secured the asset, and extracted the information necessary to dismantle an entire segment of Vale's external supply chain, leaving no trace of his intervention. When he returned to the compound, Wu Bin had begun integrating the new intelligence into a coordinated operation that stretched from Seoul to Ben and Tokyo, creating overlapping networks of surveillance and counterintelligence, ensuring that Vale could not regain its footing, while Han Li treated his injuries on the field, stitching lacerations and bandaging bruises with methodical detachment, the scent of his designation still present, powerful, unmasked. A silent signal to anyone who might still be tracking the compound's defenses. He allowed himself a moment to observe Wu Bin, to measure the man's calm, calculating presence, recognizing that the trust between them was no longer transactional, no longer dictated by protection or obligation, but earned through understanding, through the recognition of skill, discipline, and restraint. And as the night stretched onward, Han Li made another series of calculated moves, strategic incursions into Vale's lesser-known cells, subtle misdirections that caused internal friction, and precise neutralizations that left the organization's most valuable operatives questioning their own methods. And with each act, the slow unraveling of Vale continued, not through brute force, but through a patient, meticulous operational mastery that had always been Han Li's greatest weapon, proving that even a fractured Omega, fully exposed and biologically compromised, could redefine the architecture of control and shift the balance of power across a network that had once been untouchable. The first light of day stretched over Seoul with the same indifferent clarity it had every morning, washing the Iron Court compound in soft gold that highlighted the scars of the night's battles. Yet Han Li did not look outward. He stood in the control room beside Wu Bin, reviewing the final threads of intelligence, mapping the destruction and exposure of Vale's network with meticulous care. Every marker, every operative accounted for, the city outside unaware that its underworld had been reshaped in a single, violent, and calculated night. Dokkyong moved among the operational stations, ensuring that every captured operative, every neutralized threat, was processed and contained with the precision Han Li demanded, recognizing that the act of non-lethal control was as much a statement as the strikes themselves, a testament to Han Li's refusal to be a tool for destruction rather than a force for calibrated resolution. Han Li's body ached, his suppressant still recovering, muscles bruised, forearms tattooed with compounds cycling below full efficacy. Yet his mind remained sharp, a machine of strategy, constantly parsing new intelligence, projecting Vale's likely responses, identifying the gaps and fractures that would allow the organization to be dismantled methodically, completely, leaving no opportunity for resurgence, and he knew the next months would demand the same relentless focus. the same refusal to allow personal fatigue to compromise operational integrity. Wu Bin studied him for a long moment, the weight of understanding settling over both men without the need for words, because the night had established something immutable, a recognition that Han Li was no longer merely a protector, a bodyguard, or a suppressed Omega. He was a stateless operative, unbound by designation, autonomous in thought, and fully capable of directing the forces around him to achieve objectives that even the most experienced syndicates could not anticipate. Outside, the city began its ordinary rhythm, commerce and traffic moving without awareness of the quiet, calculated upheaval that had secured it from threats that had once been untouchable. And inside the compound, Han Li and Wu Bin finalized the operational blueprint for Vale's dismantlement, a plan that would stretch across continents, synchronized with assets previously unknown to Vale, relying on intelligence, misdirection, and the patience that Han Li had cultivated over 9 years. The patience that transformed instantaneous action into long-term dominance. Han Li took a deep breath, acknowledging the physical toll, the wound on his side, the bruising across his shoulder, the strain of sleepless nights. But he allowed no hesitation to touch the operational clarity he had built. And as he did, he felt a rare, almost imperceptible shift in the air between him and Wu Bin, a recognition that they had moved beyond necessity and transaction into something rare, a mutual respect forged in calculation, trust, and shared danger. The final files were transmitted to allied agencies, journalists, and secure operatives across Seoul, Ben, and Tokyo, ensuring Vale's exposure could not be contained. And Han Li watched the screens, noting the network fracturing in real time, operatives uncertain of who to trust, communications compromised, protocols rendered useless, and he allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this dismantlement was surgical, clean, and irreversible, yet executed without the wanton destruction that would have made him another monster in Vale's design. Wu Bin placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, not as an alpha over an omega, not as a commander over a subordinate, but as a partner in strategy, and Han Li met the gesture without flinching, feeling the acknowledgement that the work had been done, that the choice to remain in this structure had been validated, and that together they had created a new equilibrium. Han Li finally stood in the early morning light, looking over the compound, the city beyond, and the quiet aftermath of 53 neutralized assassins who had survived because he chose precision over lethality. And he understood that his life, once dictated by Vale's designation and suppression, was now fully his own, defined not by orders or bonds, but by the decisions he made, the operational clarity he maintained, and the rare, hard-won ability to exist unchained in a world that had always sought to control him. And as the sun rose fully, spilling light across the marble steps, the fires reduced to smoldering embers, and the city awake but oblivious, Han Li allowed himself a long, measured exhale, knowing that the coming months would demand vigilance, patience, and ruthlessness in the pursuit of dismantling Vale. But for the first time in 9 years, he felt the rare, undeniable presence of choice, freedom, and purpose, standing beside Wu Bin, fully exposed, fully alive, and entirely unbound. A stateless Omega, whose decisions now shaped the fate of the shadows themselves.